In 1919, at the end of what was then the most murderous war in human history, the German social scientist Max Weber issued an article in which he defined the state as the entity that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in the enforcement of its order. That is, only the state can put you in prison. Only the state can kill you for violating its laws. Only the state can go to war with other states.
Larken, what is government and why are you anti-government?
Government is the notion that certain political rituals, whether it's elections or appointments or whatever else, can actually bestow upon a select group of human beings the right to rule. It's not just about the ability to control. Lots of people, if they have a gun, might have the ability to control their neighbor by force. That doesn't make them government. Government is the exercise of authority, meaning the right to rule, which never actually exists. The right is imagined. The thugs are real, the guns are real, the violence is very real, all too real, but the right to do it, the authority to do it, is always a lie. So the problem is not the thing over there called government. It is the fact that people view it as government, as a thing that actually has the right to coercively control us. And that's why I talk about the fact that those people and their guns are not actually the problem. The belief system and people imagining that there is such thing as a legitimate, rightful ruling class, that is the problem.
Mark, what is government and why do you not support the legitimacy of government or a state?
Government is a false and illusory religious belief. I would go even further and say that government is a cult. It is a cult belief system because the definition of a cult is a religious belief that is actually harmful to members that are not its believers or adherents. And the basic belief structure of those who believe in government is that there is such a thing called authority that is vested in man, and that is entirely rooted in the concept of violence, which is the initiation of harmful behavior toward other beings that are exercising their rights because of the commands or demands of a ruling class that call themselves the legislators or lawmakers that want to impose their will violently upon other beings, coercively, violently upon other beings, and therefore restrain their rights. That's what government is to me. And ultimately, if you really take what I just said there and condense it down, it comes down to three simple words. Government is slavery.
In the realm of biology, and it is also completely invalid in the realm of ethics. This is the argument for statelessness, right? That if you say, well, there are some human beings who have the right and the obligation to initiate the use of force against others, which is the government and its police and its military and so on, whereas other people have no possible right to initiate the use of force against others because they can't go around killing and raping and stealing and murdering and so on, then you have created a category called humanity, which has opposite moral requirements or demands. And that is invalid, logically. So there would be an argument to say that, free speech and statelessness are certainly the morally and logically consistent ideals for humanity, and anybody who creates artificial oppositional categories under the same conceptual umbrella is making a terrible, terrible mistake.
What is the state and what is it not?
The state is a ruling class that claims to have the monopoly on violence, the right to do to us what we would not be allowed to do to each other. So the state is necessarily an institution that can impose violence against you, take your property, take your children, take your life, draft you, tax you, regulate you, threaten you with violence if you don't comply. We can't do that with each other. In fact, if I came up to you and did anything the state does to you every day, I would get arrested. So that's what the state is. It is not an institution that enforces rules. Okay, we're surrounded by institutions that have rules. I just got back from Cancun, where I went to a private resort. The rules in this private resort were ridiculous. I mean, just over the top, right? So, like, I tried to go to dinner, and you can't believe it, but they rejected me on grounds of I didn't comply with the dress code. Now, keep in mind, I had a tie on and a jacket, everything. The difference was that I was wearing loafers and shorts down to my knees. Well, they did not allow shorts in the restaurant. So otherwise, so they refused entry for me. I couldn't believe it. In a restaurant and in a resort where I had paid to be. So I had to go back to my room and put on pants, and then they let me right in. But you see, that was a rule, but I had agreed to comply with that rule by virtue of being in that resort, and they let me into the resort because I paid to be there. So it's still all voluntary. Rules are inevitable in all of society. Now, what would happen if I said, no, damn it, I want a table? Well, a bodyguard would have come in and said, I'm sorry, sir, you can't do this, and shuffled me to my room. And if I complained more, they said, I'm sorry, you would have to leave the hotel. So they kicked me out, but they're not actually killing me, right? They're kicking me out of the hotel. They're ending their contractual exchange with me because I had stopped complying with the contract. That is not the way the state deals with this. So private rules are just part of life, and that is not the same thing as the state. This is very difficult for people to understand, actually. But when you go to a gym and they say there's you have to wear, you can't scream while you lift up barbells, and you continue to do it, then they're going to end your gym membership and kick you out, right? But that's not the same thing as coercion. That's the end of a contractual relationship. But here's the thing: the state never makes a contract with us, right? So they can talk about social contracts and that kind of nonsense, but none of it's actually true. It's actually a relationship rooted in violence rather than choice.
Anyways, a government is the subset of a society which claims to have a legitimate monopoly on the use of force, a legitimate monopoly on the right to make fundamental rules, and also has sufficient physical power to actually back up that monopoly. Right? So that's why, like, a failed state like we might have had in Somalia in the late 80s would be something where there might be a group that claims to have a monopoly, but they're not actually able to maintain it. So the government sort of failed in that sense. So government is a group of people, a subset that has a monopoly of force and makes rules and actually imposes those rules upon others. That's not a perfect definition because, of course, lots of rules come about through non-governmental means. There's all sorts of private governance, even under states where there are governments, but the states claim to have this fundamental law-making power, and they have the ability to back it up. Government's not the name we give to the things that we do together. We do all sorts of things together without government. Government is the name that we give to the people with the guns. Whether that's good or bad is an open question, but that's fundamentally what a government is.
Sure, yeah, that's what makes it a unique institution. You talk about two things in this book: authority and legitimacy. What is authority and legitimacy?
Good. It's worth noting for people who I say this in that book. I say it in the When All Else Fails book. The terms authority and legitimacy are used quite frequently by political philosophers, but they're not perfectly standardized. So I use them a particular way, but what everyone agrees upon is that governments claim to have two special moral powers or moral properties. So one is governments claim that they have the ability and the permission to create rules and enforce those rules with violence. I use the word legitimacy to refer to that. Legitimacy means the permissibility of using violence to do something. And when we're talking about government legitimacy, the permissibility of using violence and other kinds of aggressive, coercive means to force compliance with rules that you make. So that's legitimacy. Authority is supposed to refer to the idea of when they issue a command or an edict, a law or regulation, you have an obligation in virtue of them issuing that command to follow it. So it's very important that when you ask, is there a duty to obey the law? You're asking, is there authority? Does that government have authority over you? And it's important to note that you could have an obligation to obey the law, but not because it is the law. And that, in which case, it's not authority. So if I say right now, I, Jay Brennan, hereby declare myself to be the one and true emperor of the planet Earth, and I now command all of you watching, never to commit murder. Well, you have an obligation to do the thing that I said, avoid committing murder, but you don't have that obligation because I said so. You don't owe it to me or owe it to other people to listen to me per se. My command is sort of morally inert. So in contrast, people who believe in the idea of an obligation to obey the law per se think that when certain government agents or actors or bodies issue commands or laws, you have to obey that law because they said so. They cause you to have an obligation. They might add an additional source of, like if the government commands you not to murder, they think you had a pre-existing obligation not to murder, plus now you have an obligation not to murder because the government said so. You have two different grounds for it. Or it might be in some cases you didn't have any obligation at all until you were so commanded. The military officer had no obligation to attack another country until he was told to do so by his superior.
I think you are privatizing something that is what essentially sets a nation state apart, which is the monopoly on violence. And to set those kinds of precedents, I think, will lead us over the long term into some troubled water.
Now, what is government? So there's a very famous definition of government due to Max Weber. Max Weber is basically the founder of sociology, and he defined government as he defined the state as, quote, a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Now, as a side terminological note, people in political philosophy use the word state interchangeably with government. In the United States, people sometimes use the word state to refer to, like the state of Colorado. But in political philosophy, when we say that, we mean the government in general. Okay, now there might be some problems with Weber's definition. You might notice that there are plenty of legitimate uses of physical force that don't involve the government. So if somebody attacks you and you physically defend yourself, that's a legitimate use of physical force. Now, what Weber would probably say is, yeah, but it's only considered legitimate because the state authorizes it, because you're legally authorized to defend yourself in such a situation. But that's a little bit questionable because most people think it's legitimate even if the government hadn't authorized it. However, be that as it may, there are two key attributes of the state that Weber talks about that are important and that are widely accepted. They're that the state is monopolistic and that it's coercive. So it's widely agreed, whether or not you accept exactly Weber's definition, it's widely agreed that the government is coercive. In other words, it issues commands to people and it forces them to obey them. It doesn't simply ask you to obey its directives. There's a threat that some armed officers will come and do something to you if you don't obey their commands. It's also widely agreed that the state is monopolistic. In other words, it's a kind of organization that does not allow competitors. So if you try to set up a competing organization that does the same things that the government does, the government will send armed men to forcibly shut you down. If you try to set up your own police force or your own court system, or you try to make your own laws, if anyone other than the government does that, then the government will forcibly shut them down. So that's the monopoly aspect.
When we're truly free. It doesn't mean there won't be any evil in the world. In fact, a stateless society is a recognition of the fact that evil exists, and the first place that evildoers go is to the state, to gain control over the state, right? If human beings are all good, we don't need the state. If human beings are all evil, we can't afford the state. If human beings are mostly evil and only somewhat good, then the mostly evil people vote for democratic policies that overwhelm and subjugate the good people. If people are mostly good and only somewhat evil, which is my belief, then the good people become the tax livestock controlled by the evil people who swarm to the state to gain control over the good. There is no scenario of any admixture of good and evil which justifies the existence of the state. The state is a giant magnet for monsters in human form.